is right here, and good
That's
afternoon.
fine.
Good evening. My name is Jerry Grimes, and I am seeking our party's nomination for the House of Representatives in the 1st Congressional District. Earlier this week, we all witnessed a great injustice. And I do not use the word lightly, but we truly witnessed a tragedy. As someone who has preached more funerals than I have ever cared to preach, and as someone who has eulogized more persons than I have ever cared to in my ministry, I am quite familiar with the unfortunate tone and feeling and despair that comes with tragedy. The nearly 700,000 residents in the 1st Congressional District over the past year begged and pleaded with our so-called representative that he would at least read H.R. 3962 when it was formed in his committee, the Committee of Energy and Commerce. And I have yet, even with 3 master's degrees, I have yet to be able to figure out how a health care bill begins in the Committee of Energy and Commerce. The representative, our so-called representative, admitted that he had not read the bill, but he had only read executive summaries, the equivalent of Cliff's Notes. Now, I have served as a university lecturer, and when I require my students to read a certain number of chapters and pages, that is the assignment. His assignment, according to Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution, his duty, as made clear by James Madison in Federalist Number 57, is to read the legislation that is placed before him, but most importantly, to listen to the care, concerns, and issues of those persons who sent him to Washington. That was not done. And even worse, it was not H.R. 3962 that was passed into law. It was H.R. 3590. And the Reconciliation Act was based upon H.R. 3590, the Senate version of the bill. Meaning, once again, our so-called representative, and I will have to keep calling him our so-called representative until he exhibits some quality that remotely smacks of what our founders and framers intended in Article 1, Section 2. Our so-called representative, in no shape, form, or fashion, could have read H.R. 3590, meaning that the healthcare legislation that unfortunately is no longer a bill but is now a law, consists of over 4,000 pages. And I said earlier this week, apparently each horseman of the apocalypse wrote 1,000 pages of the bill each. But unfortunately, it has become law. So now I ask, are we ready for true representation? Constitutional representation, and not misrepresentation. It was Shakespeare who placed into the mouth of Hamlet these words: brevity is the soul of wit. And so with that, I plan to be as witty as possible and conclude my comments. But I will say this much. I'm sure that everyone here knows, and I also know, that the 1st Congressional District is in fact gerrymandered. We all know that. And not since 1883 has a Republican held this seat. So despite this district being gerrymandered, I'm Jerry Grimes, so I feel that I'm the man for the job. Are there any questions? That is a very valid question, particularly in this district. And I would first say that I do not consider myself an African American because Africa is a continent, and so unless I am African North American, I consider myself an American who And so in that sense, that is a very valid question. Earlier this week, just 2 hours before the president signed H.R. 3590 into law, I appeared on a radio station, WFMC, 7:30 a.m. And on that radio station, the listenership has given the president an 84% approval rating. Now, you must ask the question, how does a Republican prepare to have an interview on a station in which its listeners have given the president an 84% approval rating? Well, the first thing that I said was, I disagree with this healthcare legislation. I don't approve of it at all. However, I had a copy of the bill with me, so I was able to point out the various issues and answer questions and begin a conversation. What I found is that there are quite a few registered Democrats who have just as many questions about this bill. But unfortunately, polarization has been created, and we realize that in this district, Congressman Butterfield has done a masterful job of creating racialization and polarization and turning persons against one another and moving away from the issue at hand. So for instance, I was able to discuss the fact that on page 681 through 686, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services has ultimately given the power to determine at what point someone's Medicaid or Medicare benefits will expire. That is a frightening prospect. Furthermore, with regards to TRICARE for Life, in the year 2014, as the U.S. Health Insurance Exchange is created, persons whose benefits, even our veterans, even our disabled veterans, even our retired military whose benefits expire, will have to enroll into the U.S. Health Insurance Exchange in order to receive the rest of their benefits. And so if you can imagine the image of cattle being herded into a slaughterhouse, between the year 2014 and 2019, this massive government bureaucracy in the form of the U.S. Health Insurance Exchange is what many persons will be required to register into, even if they have a pre-existing plan with another insurance company. And so I began discussing issues. And when we begin discussing substantive issues and we move away from the partisan infighting, and we move away from the so-called polarization of our communities, and realize that we are all Americans living not in a white community or a black community, but living in an American community, and discuss what we all want, which is better lives, and to create better lives for our children. That is how I will be able to combat Congressman Butterfield on the issues, on his record. Why is it that 16 times in the last 6 years, on the floor of the House, resolutions were proposed that would have allowed communities of faith and congregations to be able to access federal funds? 16 times he voted against them. Why is it that he has never had to firmly stand up and tell people how he defines marriage, as either being between one man and one woman, or apparently according to his voting record, between two men or two women? Why is it that he has never had to discuss his voting record with regards to the protection of life? He has never had to discuss many of his votes. He has never been involved in a street fight in his entire political career. And so in that sense, facing me as a candidate for the first time in his political life, he will have to fight me on every street corner, to every rooftop, through all 23 counties, including the 7 that are split with the 3rd district. I will fight him on those issues. On the issues, on what impacts our lives. And I will not allow him to get away with the unfair characterization of our party. And let's be honest, we all know how our party has been mischaracterized. And so on that radio broadcast, I said to people, and I will say the same thing I said now in case you happen to find that interview, I may very well be the first and last Republican who you ever hear quote both Senator Jesse Helms and Malcolm X in the same breath. And here goes the quote. With regards to the protection of the unborn and protecting life, I say what Senator Helms said. Show me a fetus that has committed murder, and I'll execute it. Otherwise, leave it alone. And with regards to what Malcolm X said just 5 weeks before he was assassinated, he said the greatest threat to the black man in America is not the white man. It is himself, his vices, his drinking, his smoking, his gambling, his womanizing, his selling of reefer and drugs, his fatherlessness, his imprisonment, which will rob the black community of 90% of its moral and economic potential. That was his quote. And so in that sense, by the time I was done, there were registered Democrats coming to the radio station to find out who I was. That is how I will fight Congressman Butterfield. If I face him, if I'm given the honor of being our party's nominee, I will give him the fight of his political life and his life writ large.